All right, everyone. Tonight we're diving into a topic that's both juicy and scholarly, the intimate, perplexing, and at times truly peculiar realm of medieval sexuality. It was an age of knightly deeds and questionable herbal concoctions, a period where initiating intimacy often involved a polite request and a hope that no one was observing. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the content I create. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now, let's dim the lights, perhaps put on a fan for a gentle ambient sound, and embark on this journey together into a world where romance was intricate, privacy was a luxury, and passion had to navigate the stern dictates of religious authorities. Let's address the most significant misconception about medieval intimacy. It did not take place under silken canopies and candlelit chambers, with a lute serenading the moment. The reality for most was a small single-room dwelling shared by an entire family, which could include elderly relatives, young children, a pair of goats, and a particularly opinionated chicken regarding personal space. Privacy, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent. Most common folk inhabited homes where the kitchen, sleeping area, and even the stable occupied the same general footprint, distinguished only by varying aromas. For a couple seeking a private moment, ingenuity was paramount. Timing was crucial, as was the control of one's voice. And ideally, the children would be asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a rare luxury. Beds were shared, and even among the aristocracy, servants might be sleeping at the foot of the bed, or standing unobtrusively in a corner. Many noble households maintained records of sleeping arrangements for legal or spiritual reasons, which, as you can imagine, was an exceptionally awkward undertaking. Travel did little to enhance privacy. Inns frequently featured communal sleeping quarters. Yes, complete strangers might share a bed for the night, adding another layer of complexity. Hoping for a moment of affection, you'd best ascertain if the bed was already occupied and check if your companion had brought their boots. If married, and both individuals were awake and reasonably clean, one could share a straw-filled mattress and hope for the best. If unmarried, discretion became paramount, requiring twice the quiet and thrice the caution. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip spread with alarming speed, often faster than plague-ridden rodents. For those residing in monasteries or convents, the directive was unequivocal: none. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no clandestine late-night exchanges. Yet, even within these walls, human nature occasionally presented challenges, which might explain the unusually high garden walls surrounding many abbeys. The physical environment for medieval intimacy presented difficulties that modern individuals can scarcely fathom. The typical peasant dwelling was a single chamber with a packed earth floor, a thatched roof, and walls constructed from wattle and daub, essentially sticks and mud. The air was a complex blend of smoke, animal effluvia, unwashed bodies, and whatever decomposing matter was present that week. Beds, when they existed, were usually rudimentary straw-filled sacks laid upon wooden frames. The straw was seldom, if ever, replaced, often becoming a haven for fleas, lice, and other undesirable inhabitants. The scratchy, poking sensation from worn straw acted as another obstacle to romantic endeavors. Illumination was typically provided by candles, oil lamps, or the fading embers of the hearth fire. This scenario could create an atmosphere that was either romantically subdued or incredibly dark, depending on one's objective. The flickering light cast shifting shadows that could imbue the scene with mystery, or simply prove frustrating for tasks requiring fine motor skills. Temperature regulation was non-existent. During winter, couples faced the dilemma of either enduring the cold or risking a fire by placing the brazier too close to their straw bedding. In summer, the cumulative body heat, heavy clothing, and poor ventilation could transform intimate moments into tests of endurance rather than expressions of affection. The ambient sounds of medieval life provided a constant auditory backdrop, rarely conducive to romance. Animals grunted and shifted, children whimpered, adults snored, and the wind whistled through the inevitable gaps in the walls. Any attempt at intimate conversation had to contend with this incessant clamor of daily existence. Hygiene posed another considerable challenge. Regular bathing was an infrequent occurrence, And when it did happen, it was often a communal activity, offering minimal personal privacy. Most individuals would cleanse themselves with cold water and coarse cloths, if they bothered cleaning themselves at all. Consequently, intimate encounters frequently involved navigating an assortment of unsavory odors and textures. Clothing presented its own set of impediments. Medieval attire was intricate, multi-layered, and often secured by numerous ties, pins, and fastenings. The act of undressing was a protracted affair, requiring patience and, at times, assistance. The heavy fabrics and numerous layers meant that partial disrobing was often the most practical approach. The prevailing social expectations concerning intimate conduct were rigid and well-defined. Couples were expected to conduct themselves with modesty and restraint, even in private settings. Overt displays of passion or excessive enthusiasm were viewed with suspicion and could lead to accusations of sinfulness or moral laxity. Despite these challenges, medieval couples discovered ways to express their affection and desires. They developed subtle cues and coded language that permitted them to convey their intentions without attracting undue attention. They learned to capitalize on fleeting moments of privacy and to find intimacy in understated gestures and quiet exchanges. The level of creativity required to sustain romantic relationships under such conditions was remarkable. Couples had to be resourceful, patient, and discreet. They had to reconcile their natural inclinations with societal expectations and practical limitations. In many respects, the constraints of medieval life rendered successful romantic partnerships more valuable and meaningful than they might have been in less demanding circumstances. In the medieval world, few forces shaped private lives as profoundly as the Church, and it had a great deal to say about what transpired behind closed doors, or, more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to Church doctrine, physical intimacy served a single primary purpose: procreation. That was its sole sanctioned function, not pleasure, not emotional bonding, not stress relief, solely reproduction. Anything beyond that was at best a distraction and at worst, sinful. This principle wasn't confined to Sunday sermons. Bishops, theologians, and confessors authored detailed guidelines specifying acceptable and unacceptable practices, should anyone dare to deviate. Certain days of the week were designated as off-limits, as were major feast days, fasting periods, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Considering intimacy with your spouse during Lent, think again. Advent was also prohibited. This left a very narrow window, perhaps a Tuesday in April. Even within marriage, expectations were stringent. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Displays of affection were permissible, but not excessive. Expressions of passion were, to put it mildly, discouraged. One 13th century guide advised married couples to engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which, by all accounts, describes a rather joyless checklist. The preferred posture was the missionary position, and not solely for its symbolic religious significance. It was deemed the most natural and, consequently, the least likely to offend God, the saints, or the local clergy. Any deviation was considered suspect, including any hint of enthusiasm. Confession also played a role. Priests frequently posed pointed questions during confession to ascertain whether couples had violated any moral or ecclesiastical regulations. These were not vague spiritual inquiries. They were highly specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let it be said that the average 14th century friar likely knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Nevertheless, the enforcement of these rules varied. Some regions adhered to stricter interpretations, while others were more lenient. Some priests disregarded these regulations entirely, and many lay individuals, particularly peasants, would simply nod politely and proceed with their intentions discreetly. The theological rationale underpinning these restrictions was complex and often contradictory. The Church taught that sexual desire was an inheritance of original sin, a corruption of humanity's initial state of purity. However, it also acknowledged that sexual activity was essential for procreation and the perpetuation of the human race. This created a fundamental tension that Church authorities found challenging to reconcile. The concept of conjugal duty was central to medieval Church teachings on marital sexuality. This doctrine posited that married partners owed each other sexual availability, and that refusing one's spouse without valid justification constituted a sin. However, this obligation was riddled with numerous caveats and qualifications, making its fulfillment without risking spiritual contamination a precarious endeavor. The Church's calendar of prohibited times was extensive and detailed. In addition to the major liturgical seasons, couples were expected to abstain during women's menstrual periods, during pregnancy, while nursing, and for extended periods both before and after childbirth. When all these restrictions were aggregated, the number of days considered permissible for marital intimacy was surprisingly limited. The enforcement of these decrees fluctuated dramatically, depending on the geographical location, social standing, and the individual priest's interpretation of canon law. Urban parishes with educated clergy might enforce the regulations rigorously, whereas rural areas with less oversight could be more accommodating. Affluent families with private chaplains might face more scrutiny than impoverished peasants who seldom encountered a priest. Medieval penitential literature offers a detailed lens into the Church's stance on sexuality. These handbooks for confessors cataloged numerous sexual transgressions, along with their prescribed penances, which could range from short periods of fasting to years dedicated to atonement. The granular detail within these lists implies that medieval individuals engaged in a broad spectrum of sexual conduct, notwithstanding official condemnation. The Church's pronouncements on sexual enjoyment were notably intricate. While pleasure was generally met with suspicion, certain theologians posited that a restrained enjoyment within matrimony could be deemed permissible, provided it did not become the predominant impetus for sexual engagement. This established a delicate boundary that couples were compelled to tread with caution to avert sin. The role assigned to women in medieval church doctrines concerning sexuality was notably restrictive. Females were perceived as both the origin of sexual temptation and the targets of male desire. They were expected to assume a passive stance in sexual encounters and were held accountable for curbing male lust through their deportment and appearance. The Church's influence on medieval sexual practices extended beyond marital unions to encompass comprehensive directives for courtship, betrothal, and wedding ceremonies. The process of establishing a valid marriage was rigorously regulated to ensure that sexual intercourse was confined exclusively to appropriately sanctioned unions. Despite the Church's pervasive regulations, there is evidence indicating that many medieval individuals devised methods to bypass or disregard the official doctrines. Love letters, poetry, and artistic creations from this epoch suggest that ardor and delight played a significant part in numerous relationships, irrespective of official disapproval. The medical theories prevalent at the time frequently clashed with the Church's teachings, introducing further bewilderment for medieval couples. Medical practitioners asserted that sexual activity was crucial for health and that abstinence could precipitate illness. This medical counsel often contradicted religious tenets, leaving couples to make a choice between their spiritual and physical welfare. The Church's directives on sexuality also carried substantial political ramifications. The oversight of sexual conduct was deemed indispensable for upholding societal order and warding off the chaos believed to arise from unbridled passion. Sexual sins were frequently regarded as threats to the stability of society as a whole. If you believe modern couples struggle to synchronize their schedules, spare a thought for those in the Middle Ages. Orchestrating a romantic rendezvous in that era necessitated a calendar, the priest's benediction, and the good fortune of Saint Valentine himself, who, with ironic flair, never married. The Church had its directives, and by directives we mean stringent prohibitions on when intimacy was permissible. Sundays were an absolute no. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays, still a day of penance. Wednesdays viewed with suspicion. Factor in Lent, a 40-day observance. Advent, another 40 days. Various saint feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain lunar phases. And you'll find the calendar was less a schedule and more a divine obstacle course. The aim was to keep the soul fixed on heaven, even when the body harbored different inclinations. There were even lists, actual lists of forbidden days. Some confession manuals specified nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you experienced heightened affection during one of those prescribed days, well, brace yourself for spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop admonished a married couple for their excessive affection, which amounted to more than once a month. He advised them to redirect their ardor toward prayer. The couple, reportedly, was unimpressed. Naturally, the upper echelons of society were more subjected to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors constantly overseeing them. Peasants, meanwhile, adopted a more relaxed approach. Their lives were dictated by livestock, weather, and the imperative to survive the cold, leaving less bandwidth for dwelling on whether Tuesday marked the feast of St. Nuna, the perpetually chaste. To compound matters, some believed that intimacy during the wrong period could result in sickly offspring, divine retribution, or, most direly, a damaged reputation. If your neighbors discovered you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to disgrace, gossip, or a sternly worded sermon delivered with maximum pointed eye contact. The intricacies of the medieval liturgical calendar rendered adherence to these restrictions exceedingly challenging for ordinary individuals. The Church's calendar year was replete with overlapping cycles of feast days, fast days, and penitential seasons, which could fluctuate annually based on the date of Easter and other movable feasts. Local saint days introduced an additional layer of complexity to the calendar of prohibitions. Each region boasted its own patron saints and local observances carrying their own restrictions. A couple might believe they had identified a permissible day, only to learn it was the feast of some obscure local martyr requiring sexual abstinence. Seasonal restrictions proved particularly arduous. Lent, the 40-day period preceding Easter, was a time of fasting and penance during which sexual activity was strictly forbidden. Advent, the season preceding Christmas, imposed similar curtailments. These two periods alone removed nearly 3 months from the calendar of acceptable intimacy. The weekly cycle of restrictions was equally demanding. Fridays were forbidden as days of penance commemorating Christ's crucifixion. Sundays were off limits as days of rest and worship. Wednesdays were often designated as additional fast days. This left only 4 days of the week when intimacy might be deemed acceptable, and even those were subject to other stipulations. The menstrual cycle introduced another layer of prohibition. Women were considered ritually impure during their monthly periods and for several days thereafter. This biological reality, combined with the Church's teachings on ritual purity, eliminated additional days from the already constrained calendar of permissible intimacy. Pregnancy and childbirth brought their own set of restrictions. Sexual activity was forbidden during pregnancy to safeguard the developing child, and for extended periods post-birth, while the mother was deemed impure. Given the frequency of pregnancies in medieval families, these restrictions could diminish months or even years from a couple's intimate life. The enforcement of calendar restrictions varied significantly, depending on the diligence of local clergy and the social standing of the couples involved. Affluent families with private chaplains faced constant scrutiny, whereas impoverished peasants in remote areas might go months without encountering a priest capable of enforcing the rules. Some couples attempted to circumvent the restrictions by seeking special dispensations from church authorities. Such requests were seldom granted and often resulted in increased scrutiny and penance. The Church was generally unsympathetic to arguments based on personal desire or marital contentment. The psychological toll of these calendar restrictions was considerable. Couples lived in persistent apprehension of inadvertently transgressing the rules and incurring sin. The complexity of the regulations meant that even well-intentioned couples could easily err and find themselves in need of confession and penance. The medical community of the era frequently disagreed with the Church's calendar restrictions. Physicians contended that regular sexual activity was essential for health, and that prolonged abstinence could lead to physical and mental ailments. This conflict between medical and religious counsel imposed augmented stress upon medieval couples. Despite the extensive restrictions, evidence suggests that many couples found ways to sustain intimate relationships year-round. Love letters and personal documents from the period implied that passion frequently triumphed over piety, albeit usually accompanied by significant guilt and anxiety regarding the spiritual repercussions. Romance in medieval Europe was less about the act of falling in love, and more about entering into a legally binding arrangement. If you were anticipating candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you would have been better off perusing a troubadour ballad. Budding real-life relationships for most individuals involved livestock, land rights, and the agreement of 2 families to avoid initiating a feud. Marriage was primarily a commercial transaction. Daughters were exchanged to solidify alliances, acquire property, or establish peace between neighbors who had previously disputed whose pig had consumed whose cabbage. A bride might arrive with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small parcel of farmland. In return, the groom's family might pledge not to be entirely unbearable. Courtship, when it occurred, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely experienced private moments. A maiden might be observed by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if matters became particularly serious, an entire village invested in whether or not hands were held. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess strategies, and affection was something one developed subsequently, or not at all. As one medieval proverb famously, though perhaps apocryphally, stated, "Better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples." Romantic indeed. Even among peasants, practical considerations prevailed. A man's suitability was assessed based on his land, tools, or the size of his ox. Women were evaluated on their domestic abilities, reputation, and general capacity to avoid creating disruptions at the marketplace. This is not to suggest that love was absent. It existed, but it typically emerged after marriage, not prior to it. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a prerequisite. Think of it as medieval emotional downloadable content, not included in the initial marriage package. Nevertheless, where there's a will, there's a way around things. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit strolls to the village well served as the clandestine side quests of medieval dating. However, caution was advised. Being discovered in a clandestine embrace behind the barn could lead to public penance, a financial penalty, or the severe disapproval of a father wielding a pitchfork. The intricate and highly formalized rituals of medieval courtship, particularly among the aristocracy, were elaborate. The concept of courtly love, disseminated by troubadours and poets, presented an idealized vision of romance that bore little resemblance to the practical realities of most people's lives. This literary convention emphasized devotion, hardship, and unattainable desire, themes more suited to verse than to actual relationships. The involvement of intermediaries was essential in medieval courtship. Typically, unions were arranged by parents, guardians, or professional matchmakers who possessed a thorough understanding of the intricate network of familial alliances, property rights, and societal obligations governing the medieval world. These negotiations could span months or even years, with the couple themselves having minimal influence on the proceedings. The exchange of gifts during courtship served dual purposes, both romantic and practical. A suitor might bestow upon his intended bride jewelry, garments, or other valuable items to signify his affluence and sincere intentions. These gifts also functioned as a form of assurance. Should the engagement be terminated, the presents generally had to be returned, thereby creating financial incentives for adherence to commitments by both parties. Physical contact in medieval courtship was subject to stringent regulations and close supervision. Intimacy between unmarried individuals was generally prohibited, with even the simple act of holding hands considered improper in many settings. This fostered a highly charged atmosphere where the most minor gestures, a lingering gaze, a fleeting touch of fingers, carried profound significance. The language of medieval courtship was rich with symbolism and coded meanings. Flowers, colors, and even the manner in which clothing was worn could convey messages between prospective lovers. A woman might don a particular hue to indicate her availability, while a man could select specific blossoms to communicate his intentions. These subtle forms of communication enabled couples to express their sentiments while maintaining an outward appearance of decorum. The significance of music and poetry in medieval courtship cannot be underestimated. Troubadours and minstrels composed an extensive array of love songs that provided both entertainment and guidance in the art of romance. These songs frequently recounted tales of idealized love that served as models for actual courtship practices, though the reality was often far less dramatic than the poetry suggested. The seasonal rhythms of medieval existence significantly influenced courtship patterns. Spring and summer were favored for nuptials, as the milder weather facilitated celebrations, and the agricultural calendar permitted respite from essential labor. This established a cadence for courtship that aligned with the natural cycles of the year. The economic aspects of medieval courtship were complex and frequently proved decisive in the success or failure of relationships. The magnitude of a dowry, the worth of landed estates, and the potential for future inheritance all played critical roles in matchmaking decisions. While affection might blossom between couples, financial compatibility was imperative for their sustenance. The legal purview surrounding medieval courtship was intricate and varied by locale. The Church's stipulations for valid marriages, regional customs concerning betrothal, and the oversight of aristocratic unions by royalty or nobility collectively formed a complex set of regulations that couples were obliged to navigate. Non-compliance with established procedures could render marriages invalid and carry serious legal repercussions. The role of physical appearance in medieval courtship was considerable, though distinct from contemporary standards. While aesthetic appeal was undoubtedly valued, other attributes such as health, fertility, and social standing often held greater importance. The capacity to bear children and manage a household was frequently esteemed above physical attractiveness in most practical arrangements. The duration of medieval courtships varied considerably based on social standing and individual circumstances. Peasant couples might experience brief courtships lasting merely a few weeks, whereas noble marriages could involve years of negotiation and preparation. The intricacy of the arrangements frequently dictated the timeline more than the sentiments of the individuals involved. The privacy afforded to courting couples was exceptionally limited, presenting unique challenges for the development of emotional intimacy. Most interactions occurred in public or semi-public venues, with family members or servants present to ensure propriety. This scarcity of privacy necessitated that couples cultivate their relationships through subtle communication and shared activities rather than private discourse. In medieval Europe, managing family size was akin to attempting to steer a cart without wheels, any semblance of control, and a particularly recalcitrant goat. While technically feasible, it was not something one could reliably anticipate. To be unequivocal, individuals did make attempts. The absence of contraceptive effectiveness by today's standards did not imply that medieval people were unaware. They were acutely conscious that certain actions resulted in procreation, and many resorted to elaborate, albeit sometimes baffling, measures to prevent it. Among the more scientific approaches were herbal concoctions, animal membranes, and rituals involving the interment of specific items near the entryway. A commonly suggested practice involved consuming wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others advised the wearing of amulets blessed by individuals who were, hopefully, not merely guessing. A few manuals even claim that vigorous bouncing after intimacy would be beneficial, which, if nothing else, likely burned a few calories. Early iterations of barrier methods also existed, though labeling them as dependable would be an overstatement. Linen immersed in various mixtures was one technique. A daring few experimented with wax. Scattered documentation exists concerning what might be termed medieval precursors to later familiar latex devices, but it is advisable not to inquire about their creation. One truly does not wish to know. The Church predictably was not pleased. Any endeavor to avoid conception was frequently deemed sinful or unnatural. Procreation was avowedly the purpose of marriage, and anything impeding this divine mission was met with disapproval, or, more commonly, loud denunciation from the pulpit. Nevertheless, not all adhered to ecclesiastical guidance. Among married couples, particularly those grappling with financial hardship, the wish to space out pregnancies or forgo an additional mouth to feed was profoundly real. And among unmarried couples, it is safe to say the motivation was even more potent. However, irrespective of the method employed, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, relied on folk wisdom, local botanicals, and a surprising amount of wishful thinking. And when it failed, as it frequently did, well, that's when hasty marriages, concealed pregnancies, and a multitude of awkward conversations ensued. The herbal contraceptives employed in medieval times stemmed from centuries of folk knowledge transmitted through generations of women. Plants such as pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were commonly utilized, often prepared as infusions or applied as pessaries. While some of these herbs possessed contraceptive properties, they were also highly toxic and could induce severe illness or fatality if misused. The preparation and application of herbal contraceptives typically fell within the purview of elder women who had accumulated knowledge through practical experience. These informal practitioners, sometimes referred to as wise women, served as the primary conduit of reproductive health information for their communities. Their knowledge was disseminated orally and varied significantly from one region to another. The efficacy of medieval contraceptive methods was generally poor, yet not entirely without some degree of merit. Certain barrier techniques, such as pessaries crafted from diverse materials, could afford limited protection. However, the lack of comprehension regarding reproductive biology meant that even methods with potential effectiveness were frequently employed incorrectly or at inappropriate times. The social repercussions of contraceptive use were severe in many communities. Women known to employ such measures might face accusations of witchcraft or moral corruption. The association between contraception and sin rendered it a perilous practice that necessitated clandestine execution, thereby limiting the sharing of knowledge and improvements in techniques. The economic factors that propelled contraceptive use were substantial. Large families entailed significant expenses, and during periods of scarcity, additional children could prove the difference between survival and starvation. Economic pressure to curtail family size often superseded religious prescriptions, leading many couples to take risks with hazardous contraceptive methods. The male contribution to medieval contraception was generally restricted, though not entirely absent. Some methods, like withdrawal, necessitated male cooperation and self-restraint. Nevertheless, the principal burden of contraception typically fell upon women, who faced the most dire consequences if methods failed and pregnancy resulted. The timing strategies employed in medieval contraception were predicated on an incomplete understanding of the female reproductive cycle. While some women endeavored to track their cycles and abstain from intercourse during presumed fertile phases, the absence of precise knowledge concerning ovulation rendered these methods largely ineffective. The magical and superstitious elements intertwined with medieval contraception were extensive. Amulets, charms, and rituals were frequently employed in conjunction with, or as an alternative to, physical methods. Although these approaches held no actual contraceptive power, they provided psychological solace and a sense of agency over procreation. The international commerce and contraceptive components fostered networks of knowledge and materials that extended across medieval Europe. Exotic herbs and substances were procured from distant regions, often at considerable expense, due to their purported efficacy in preventing pregnancy. This commerce also served to disseminate contraceptive knowledge across various cultures. The legal standing of contraception differed, depending on geographical location and historical period. While the Church consistently opposed the use of contraceptives, secular authorities were frequently more focused on practical concerns such as population levels and economic stability. Certain regions enacted legislation governing the sale of contraceptive herbs, whereas others paid no heed to the practice. Medieval methods of contraception exhibited high failure rates, resulting in frequent unintended pregnancies. When contraception proved unsuccessful, couples faced difficult decisions regarding whether to carry the pregnancy to term, pursue abortion, a perilous and often illegal undertaking, or arrange swift marriages to legitimize the ensuing births. Documentation of medieval contraceptive practices is scarce because these activities were frequently conducted covertly and seldom recorded in official documents. Our understanding primarily derives from medical treatises, religious condemnations, and legal records from prosecutions, which may not accurately reflect the full spectrum of practices employed by ordinary individuals. Let us dispel one of the most persistent myths about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you have likely encountered them in cartoons, historical dramas, or rather unfortunate museum gift shops. These iron contraptions were supposedly fastened around a woman's waist while her husband was away at war, rendering her physically and morally sealed. Except, not quite. There is no substantial historical evidence to suggest that chastity belts were ever widely utilized during the Middle Ages. In fact, most existing examples today originate from the Renaissance or even the Victorian era, periods more preoccupied with the notion of medieval oppression than with actual historical events. Many of these belts were produced as novelties, cautionary items, or museum curiosities, rather than as functional devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often chronicle all manner of uncomfortable details, are conspicuously silent regarding the widespread distribution of these belts. No artisan advertised them, no laws regulated them, no churches distributed them during awkward wedding ceremonies. It is almost as if, and bear with me, they were not a genuine practice, which is logical considering their wildly impractical design. Medieval hygiene was already a challenge. Now, imagine introducing a rusty metal device with no user guide and a padlock that likely required a blacksmith's skill. It would have led to more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So, from whence did this myth originate? Likely from a confluence of later moral anxieties and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors relished the depiction of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It aligned with their narrative, and nothing signifies virtue quite like a literal keyhole on one's undergarments. In reality, fidelity was maintained through more conventional and more effective means: shame, surveillance, religious adherence, and strategic marriages. Noblewomen were frequently chaperoned to an extreme degree. Peasant girls had entire villages observing them, like unpaid private investigators, and any hint of scandal could result in damaged reputations, forfeited dowries, or awkward confessions uttered with phrases like, "at the edge of the barley field." The genesis of the chastity belt myth can be traced to several origins, none of which provide credible substantiation for their widespread use in medieval times. Certain satirical works from the Renaissance era portrayed chastity belts as emblems of male jealousy and female subjugation, but these were clearly intended as social commentary rather than historical records. The Victorian fascination with medieval barbarism led to the creation of numerous fraudulent medieval artifacts, including chastity belts. Victorian collectors and museum curators, eager to showcase the advancement of civilization, often commissioned or acquired items that confirmed their preconceived notions about the Dark Ages. These fabricated artifacts then became integrated into the historical record, perpetuating the myth. The practical challenges associated with chastity belts would have rendered them nearly impossible to use for extended durations. The human body necessitates regular cleansing and care, particularly in intimate areas. A metal apparatus that restricted access to these regions would swiftly become a source of severe infection and health complications. Medieval individuals, despite their limited understanding of hygiene, would have recognized these risks. The economic aspects of chastity belt manufacturing would have made them prohibitively expensive for the majority of the populace. The metalworking expertise required to fashion a functional belt would have been substantial, and the cost would have placed them beyond the reach of all but the most affluent families. There is no evidence of a chastity belt industry or specialized artisans who produced these items. The societal ramifications of chastity belt usage would have been immense and highly conspicuous. Were such devices commonly employed, they would have appeared in literature, art, legal documents, and religious texts. The absence of such references in medieval sources strongly suggests that chastity belts were not a significant component of medieval life. The medical knowledge possessed by medieval physicians would have made them aware of the health hazards associated with chastity belts. Medical texts from that period discuss various gynecological conditions and their treatments. However, there is no mention of problems or remedies related to the use of chastity belts. This omission is particularly noteworthy given the detailed nature of medieval medical literature. The legal framework of medieval society would have mandated some form of regulation for chastity belts had they been commonly used. Marriage laws, property rights, and personal liberties would all have been impacted by the employment of such devices. The lack of legal references to chastity belts indicates that they were not a recognized aspect of medieval legal or social practice. The religious perspectives on chastity belts would likely have been unfavorable. The Church emphasized the importance of free will in moral decision-making and would have been skeptical of mechanical contrivances used to enforce virtue. The absence of religious commentary on chastity belts, whether positive or negative, suggests that they were not a significant concern for medieval religious authorities. The archaeological evidence pertaining to chastity belts is exceedingly limited and questionable. The few existing examples possess dubious provenance and dating. Many purported medieval chastity belts have been revealed to be later fabrications, frequently created for museums or private collectors desirous of possessing medieval artifacts. Feminist interpretations of the chastity belt myth have concentrated on its symbolic significance as a representation of male dominion over female sexuality. While this symbolism is potent and relevant to discussions of gender relations, it should not be conflated with historical accuracy. The myth of the chastity belt may reveal more about later attitudes toward medieval women than about medieval reality. The persistence of the chastity belt myth in popular culture illustrates the power of compelling narratives to override historical evidence. The image of the locked and controlled medieval woman aligns with broader stereotypes of the Dark Ages and continues to influence popular perceptions of medieval life, despite the dearth of supporting evidence. The debunking of the chastity belt myth forms part of a broader endeavor by medieval historians to rectify misconceptions about the period. This work involves not only disproving false claims, but also presenting a more accurate and nuanced depiction of medieval life, including the actual methods by which sexuality and relationships were governed and controlled. In a surprising turn of events that would astonish many of their modern descendants, medieval towns did not merely tolerate brothels. In many instances, they regulated them. That is correct. In several parts of medieval Europe, particularly in urban centers, brothels operated as legitimate businesses. Town councils granted licenses, levied taxes, and even designated specific districts for such establishments long before the invention of the light bulb. Some cities went so far as to appoint officials to oversee them. These fortunate individuals were known as brothel keepers, or, more picturesquely, keepers of public women, which would sound like a particularly stressful entry on a resume. The justification for this arrangement was pragmatic, if somewhat cynical. Officials believed that permitting a controlled outlet for male desires would diminish the likelihood of graver transgressions such as adultery, assault, or, heaven forbid, dancing. Regulated brothels were viewed as a necessary evil to maintain societal order, akin to traffic signals or the existence of turnips. The church, naturally, was not enthusiastic. Officially, it condemned the entire practice. Yet, unofficially, many clerics turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from these very establishments. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You have grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Working in a brothel was not a fairy tale, but it was not necessarily a life of unremitting misery either. Some women chose the profession for economic reasons, especially widows or those lacking familial support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities, where sailors brought both coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks, yes, actual handbooks, detailing how these establishments should be managed. Clean linens, basic health inspections, and set operating hours were all part of the regulatory process. Patrons hailed from all social strata: knights, apprentices, merchants, and even monks. Despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise, entry fees varied, services were itemized, and in some cases, customers paid with eggs, wool, or whatever awkward bartering goods they happened to have on hand. It was decidedly not medieval Tinder. The regulation of medieval brothel was surprisingly sophisticated and varied significantly from city to city. In some places like Avignon during the papal residence, brothels were strictly controlled and heavily taxed. The city fathers saw them as a source of revenue and a way to maintain social order by providing an outlet for male sexual desires that might otherwise disrupt marriages and families. The licensing system for brothel often included detailed requirements about location, operation, and management. Brothels were typically required to be located in specific areas of the city, away from churches and schools, but accessible to potential customers. The buildings had to meet certain standards for cleanliness and safety, and the operators had to pay regular fees to maintain their licenses. The women who worked in medieval brothel came from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Some were widows who had few other economic options after losing their husbands. Others were young women from poor families who saw sex work as a way to earn money and potentially improve their social status. Still, others were victims of trafficking or coercion, forced into the profession against their will. The economic structure of medieval brothel was complex and often exploitative. The women typically had to pay fees to the brothel keeper for room, board, and protection. They also had to pay taxes to the city and sometimes to the church. After all these deductions, the amount of money they actually kept was often quite small, making it difficult to save enough to leave the profession. The health and safety conditions in medieval brothel were generally poor by modern standards, but they were often better regulated than other aspects of medieval life. Some cities required regular health inspections and mandated that brothel keepers provide clean bedding and basic medical care. However, the understanding of sexually transmitted diseases was limited, and effective treatments were largely unavailable. The clientele of medieval brothel was diverse and included men from all social classes. Merchants traveling on business, young apprentices, married men seeking variety, and even clergy were known to frequent these establishments. The prices were typically scaled according to the customer's ability to pay, with wealthy clients charged more for the same services. The relationship between medieval brothel and the church was complex and often hypocritical. While the church officially condemned prostitution as sinful, many religious authorities recognized its practical necessity and were willing to tolerate regulated brothel as a lesser evil. Some monasteries and churches even owned property that was rented to brothel operators, creating a direct financial interest in the trade. The legal status of prostitution varied significantly across medieval Europe. In some regions, it was completely illegal and harshly punished. In others, it was tolerated or even regulated by law. The differences often reflected local economic conditions, religious influences, and political considerations rather than consistent moral principles. The social stigma associated with prostitution was significant, but not absolute. While sex workers were generally looked down upon by respectable society, they were not necessarily outcasts. Some successful prostitutes were able to accumulate wealth and property, and a few even married into respectable families after leaving the profession. The international aspects of medieval prostitution were significant, particularly in port cities and trading centers. Women were often trafficked across borders, and the demand for exotic or foreign women created international networks of sexual commerce. These networks were often connected to other forms of trade and commerce, making them difficult to regulate or control. The seasonal patterns of medieval prostitution reflected the rhythms of medieval economic life. Demand was typically higher during harvest seasons, trade fairs, and religious festivals, when men had more money to spend and were away from their families. The winter months were often slower, creating economic hardship for sex workers who depended on regular income. The decline of regulated medieval prostitution came gradually, as changing religious attitudes, new moral reform movements, and evolving legal systems made the practice less acceptable. However, the transition was uneven, and some forms of regulated prostitution continued well into the early modern period in certain regions. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: hygiene. Specifically, what it smelled like when those ruby lips parted to speak words of courtly love. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened to reveal the aromatic reality within. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspirational concept, and minty freshness wasn't invented yet, unless you count standing near an herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable, even if achieving it was about as likely as finding a unicorn in your stable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically you probably had. The reality was that most people's breath could knock a horse unconscious at 20 paces. But social conventions required everyone to pretend otherwise. Medieval women did what they could with the limited resources available to them. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally twigs, not just for the taste, but to keep their mouths tolerable enough for close conversation. Think of it as the pre-mint version of gum, except it didn't freshen your breath so much as temporarily mask the underlying aroma of decay and desperation. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These concoctions were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. The goal was subtle improvement, not obvious dental maintenance. Toothbrushing, as we know it today, wasn't standard practice. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small fibrous twigs that could scrub the teeth and double as something to fidget with, while your suitor recited bad poetry. The effectiveness of these methods was questionable at best, and the potential for injury was considerable. The bathing situation was equally challenging for romantic encounters. While the stereotype of medieval people never bathing is exaggerated, regular washing was certainly not the norm. Most people cleaned themselves with cold water and rough cloths, if they cleaned themselves at all. Hot baths were a luxury reserved for the wealthy, or for special occasions like weddings or religious festivals. The lack of understanding about the connection between cleanliness and health meant that many people saw bathing as potentially dangerous. Some believed that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. Others thought that the layer of dirt and oil on the skin provided protection against illness. These beliefs, combined with the practical difficulties of heating water and finding privacy, made regular bathing uncommon. The clothing worn during intimate encounters presented additional hygiene challenges. Medieval garments were made from wool, linen, and other natural fibers that absorbed odors and were difficult to clean. Most people owned only a few sets of clothing, which they wore repeatedly without washing. The result was that even freshly bathed individuals might still carry the accumulated scent of daily life in their clothing. The use of perfumes and scented oils was one way that medieval people attempted to address hygiene issues. However, these products were expensive and often ineffective at masking strong body odors. The wealthy could afford imported perfumes and exotic scents, while the poor made do with local herbs and flowers. The result was often a complex mixture of natural body odors, perfumes, and environmental scents that could be overwhelming in close quarters. The seasonal variations in hygiene were significant and affected intimate relationships. In winter, when bathing was most difficult and uncomfortable, people tended to accumulate more dirt and odors. The heavy clothing required for warmth also trapped scents and made cleaning more challenging. Summer brought its own problems as increased sweating and outdoor activities created new hygiene challenges. The social expectations around hygiene varied by class and region. The nobility were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness and often employed servants to help with bathing and grooming. However, even among the upper classes, daily bathing was rare, and the standards of cleanliness were far below modern expectations. The medical understanding of hygiene was limited and often counterproductive. Many physicians believed that certain odors were signs of health and vitality, while others thought that excessive cleanliness could weaken the body's natural defenses. These beliefs influenced personal hygiene practices and made it difficult for people to make informed decisions about cleanliness. The religious attitudes toward hygiene were complex and sometimes contradictory. Some religious authorities emphasized the importance of cleanliness as a sign of spiritual purity, while others viewed excessive attention to the body as vanity and sin. These conflicting messages created confusion about the appropriate level of personal hygiene for devout Christians. The practical challenges of maintaining hygiene in medieval living conditions were enormous. Most households lacked running water, effective drainage, or sufficient ventilation. The close quarters in which the majority of people resided made private bathing a challenge. Furthermore, the scarcity of soap and other cleaning agents rendered thorough washing difficult, even when water was accessible. Medieval marital unions were not solely predicated on love, companionship, or even basic compatibility. Instead, they represented a multifaceted political and economic accord that impacted entire families, communities, and at times, entire kingdoms. The bedroom, far from being a private haven, was frequently the most scrutinized and regulated area within a medieval dwelling, where personal desires had to contend with familial expectations, religious mandates, and societal obligations. The notion of marital duty was fundamental to medieval marriage, yet it encompassed more than mere obligation. Both spouses held distinct roles and expectations, meticulously defined by law, custom, and religious doctrine. Wives were anticipated to be obedient, fertile, and chaste, while husbands were expected to be protective, providers, and faithful. Although the definition of faithfulness often afforded men greater latitude than women, the management of intimate relationships within marriage necessitated considerable skill and diplomacy. Couples were challenged to balance their personal inclinations with societal expectations, religious imperatives, and familial pressures. The bedroom thus evolved into a space where power dynamics were perpetually negotiated and renegotiated, frequently with profound repercussions for the broader relationship and family structure. The significance of fertility in medieval marriage cannot be overstated. The capacity to procreate, particularly to produce male heirs, was often the paramount criterion for a marriage's success. This imposed immense pressure on both partners, but especially on women, who were typically held accountable if pregnancies failed to materialize or if children succumbed in infancy. Consequently, the bedroom became a locale of apprehension and performance anxiety that could strain even affectionate relationships. The economic dimensions of medieval marriage permeated the most intimate aspects of the union. The dowry a woman brought to the marriage, the property a man contributed, and the potential inheritance children might receive all influenced the dynamics of marital intimacy. Couples had to consider not only their personal feelings, but also the financial ramifications of their reproductive decisions. The legal framework governing medieval marriages vested husbands with considerable dominion over their wives' bodies and reproductive choices. Women possessed limited rights to decline their husband's sexual advances, and the concept of marital rape was absent in medieval jurisprudence. Nevertheless, the reality often proved more complex, as women discovered various avenues to assert agency and exert influence within the confines of the legal system. The involvement of the extended family in medieval marriage meant that intimate relationships were seldom truly private. Parents, siblings, and other relatives frequently held opinions and exerted influence over marital dynamics. While the bedroom might have offered physical seclusion, the decisions made within it carried public consequences that affected the entire familial network. The religious oversight of medieval marriage extended to the most intimate facets of the relationship. Clerics and confessors regularly delved into marital relations, offering counsel and occasionally criticism concerning the couple's private lives. This religious supervision added further strain and anxiety surrounding sexual relationships within marriage. Societal expectations specific to different social strata engendered varied standards for marital intimacy. Couples of noble birth were expected to uphold dignity and restraint even in private settings, whereas peasant couples enjoyed greater liberty but also faced more practical limitations. These class distinctions influenced everything from the physical environment of intimate encounters to the emotional expectations of the relationship. The prevalent age disparities in medieval marriages fostered unique dynamics within intimate relationships. Many unions involved significant age gaps, with older men espousing much younger women. These relationships demanded careful negotiation of power and authority, as well as adaptation to differing levels of experience and maturity. Health considerations significantly impacted medieval intimate relationships, though they were poorly understood. The absence of effective contraception, limited medical knowledge regarding reproductive health, and high rates of maternal and infant mortality presented challenges for couples endeavoring to maintain healthy, intimate connections while navigating the risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth. The agrarian rhythms of medieval life influenced marital intimacy in ways rarely experienced by modern couples. Agricultural cycles, religious observances, and prevailing weather patterns all dictated when and how couples could engage intimately. The bedroom thus became a space that had to accommodate these external cycles, while simultaneously fulfilling the personal needs of the relationship. The privacy challenges inherent in medieval living arrangements necessitated that marital intimacy often be conducted with considerable discretion and inventiveness. The presence of servants, children, and other family members in close proximity compelled couples to develop subtle communication and timing skills to sustain their intimate relationships while upholding social proprieties. Pregnancy in medieval times was not merely a 9-month progression toward parenthood. It was a perilous undertaking that could culminate in triumph, tragedy, or an uncomfortable state in between. From the initial suspicion of conception until well after birth, medieval women navigated a landscape of superstition, rudimentary medical understanding, and social expectations that could prove as hazardous as they were exacting. The detection of pregnancy in medieval times relied on a confluence of physical signs, folk remedies, and occasionally peculiar tests. A favored method involved a woman urinating on barley and wheat seeds. Their germination supposedly indicated pregnancy, and the type of grain that sprouted first was thought to reveal the baby's gender. While this may sound outlandish, contemporary research suggests it might have possessed some accuracy due to hormonal shifts impacting plant growth. Other pregnancy tests were less scientific and more rooted in wishful thinking. Some involved scrutinizing the color and consistency of urine, while others necessitated intricate interpretations of dreams, alterations in appetite, or the behavior of domestic animals. The absence of reliable pregnancy diagnostics meant that women often remained uncertain about their condition for months, hindering their ability to anticipate the forthcoming physical and social transformations. Once pregnancy was confirmed or strongly suspected, medieval women entered a realm of restrictions, recommendations, and rituals intended to ensure a successful delivery. The counsel they received was a blend of practical wisdom, religious guidance, and utter nonsense, frequently dispensed with equal conviction and authority. Dietary recommendations for expectant mothers were extensive and often contradictory. Certain foodstuffs were believed to influence the infant's appearance, disposition, or gender, while others were thought to induce miscarriage or birth defects. Pregnant women were often advised to eschew specific meats, spices, or vegetables, while consuming others in precise quantities or preparations. The outcome was a complex and frequently restrictive diet that might have caused more harm than good. The physical activities permitted to expectant mothers were meticulously governed by family members, medical practitioners, and social conventions. Heavy lifting, strenuous exercise, and even excessive walking were frequently prohibited, predicated on the belief that physical exertion could endanger the developing fetus. Conversely, complete bed rest was also discouraged, as it was thought to weaken the mother and complicate delivery. The emotional and psychological aspects of medieval pregnancy were heavily shaped by religious and cultural beliefs concerning women's roles and capacities. Pregnant women were often viewed as simultaneously blessed and cursed, carrying new life yet burdened by Eve's transgression. This fostered a complex emotional milieu, wherein joy and anxiety were closely intertwined. The medical care accessible to pregnant women varied dramatically depending on social standing, geographic locale, and prevailing customs. Affluent women might have access to trained physicians and experienced midwives, while impoverished women relied on relatives and local healers possessing varying degrees of knowledge and proficiency. The caliber of care could significantly influence the outcome for both mother and child, distinguishing between life and death. Superstitions surrounding pregnancy were numerous and often elaborate. Expectant mothers were advised to avert their gaze from certain animals, abstain from hearing specific sounds, or avoid witnessing particular occurrences that might leave their unborn children marked. These beliefs engendered a constant state of vigilance and apprehension, as women strove to control every facet of their environment to guarantee their infant's health and appearance. The social isolation that frequently accompanied medieval pregnancy was both protective and restrictive. Pregnant women, particularly in the advanced stages, were often confined to their residences and had their social interactions curtailed. This seclusion was intended to shield both mother and child from noxious influences. However, it also severed women from support networks and customary social activities. Preparations for childbirth commenced early in pregnancy and encompassed both practical and spiritual elements. Women gathered necessary supplies, arranged for assistance, and frequently made religious vows or undertook pilgrimages to secure divine protection during labor. The inherent uncertainty of medieval childbirth rendered these preparations akin to mobilizing for battle, which, in many respects, they were. The economic implications of pregnancy were substantial for medieval families. The financial burdens associated with medical expenses, specialized nourishment, and infant preparations could deplete a family's means. Concurrently, the potential forfeiture of a woman's earnings during gestation and the postnatal period might impose further economic strain, particularly on impoverished households reliant on the contributions of every individual. The legal standing of expectant mothers was intricate and frequently disadvantageous. Pregnant women possessed restricted rights and were often subjected to additional limitations and scrutiny. Their legal capacity was commonly diminished, and their autonomy in making decisions regarding their own well-being and circumstances was often curtailed by male relatives or governing bodies. The mortality rates linked to medieval pregnancy and delivery were substantial, engendering a perpetual awareness of peril that permeated every facet of the experience. Women understood that conceiving a child could equate to a death sentence. This apprehension shaped their relationships, their spiritual devotions, and their approach to daily existence throughout their pregnancies. When the time came for medieval women to give birth, they entered a realm predominantly populated by women, governed by traditions inherited through generations of females who had gleaned from experience what was effective, what was not, and what could prove fatal. The midwife occupied the central role within this domain, functioning simultaneously as a medical attendant, a spiritual advisor, a crisis manager, and on occasion, a miracle worker. Medieval midwives were typically mature women who had themselves given birth and had acquired their expertise through tutelage under seasoned practitioners. They possessed a blend of practical acumen, herbal remedies, and spiritual practices that had been refined over centuries. Although they lacked formal medical education by contemporary standards, many were highly adept and experienced in navigating the complexities of childbirth. The instruction of medieval midwives was informal yet rigorous. Young women exhibiting aptitude and interest were mentored by established midwives, learning through observation and progressively assuming greater responsibilities. This apprenticeship model facilitated the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, though it also permitted the perpetuation of ineffective practices alongside beneficial ones. The instrumentation and methodologies available to medieval midwives were limited, yet frequently ingenious. They employed various botanicals to alleviate discomfort, stimulate labor, or arrest hemorrhaging. Birthing chairs and stools were designed to facilitate delivery in positions that leveraged gravity. Massage, physical adjustments, and emotional solace constituted integral components of the midwife's repertoire, complemented by prayers, amulets, and rituals believed to confer spiritual safeguarding. The societal standing of midwives was multifaceted, varying by locality and epoch. In certain communities, they were esteemed figures holding significant positions within the social hierarchy. In others, they were regarded with suspicion, particularly by ecclesiastical authorities who harbored reservations regarding their utilization of herbal poultices and folk customs that might be construed as arcane or heathen. The dynamic between midwives and the church was often characterized by tension and complexity. While the church acknowledged the indispensability of midwives for successful childbirth, it remained wary of their traditional methodologies and their independence from male authority. Certain jurisdictions mandated that midwives secure licenses from ecclesiastical authorities and take vows to abstain from employing prescribed practices or remedies. The economic arrangements for midwifery varied considerably. In affluent residences, midwives might receive substantial remuneration for their services and could even be retained on a permanent basis. Among the impoverished, midwives frequently operated for nominal compensation or in exchange for goods and services. Some midwives augmented their income by providing peripheral health services or by dispensing herbal remedies. The birthing chamber was the exclusive domain of the midwife, who exercised complete command over its ambiance. She dictated the permitted attendees, the requisite preparations, and the management of the delivery. This authority was both practical and symbolic, representing one of the scarce spheres where women wielded unimpeded control in medieval society. The customs and ceremonies surrounding childbirth were elaborate and differed according to region and social stratum. The birthing chamber was frequently adorned with specific linens, herbs, and religious accoutrements. Certain comestibles might be prepared to fortify the mother, and particular invocations or charms might be recited to ensure a safe delivery. These rites served both utilitarian and psychological functions, providing solace and structure during a perilous and unpredictable process. The complications encountered by medieval midwives were numerous and frequently life-threatening. Presentations of the fetus in a breech position, protracted labor, excessive bleeding, and infections were all prevalent issues demanding skill and experience for resolution. The midwife's capacity to identify and address these predicaments often determined the outcome between life and death for both mother and offspring. The pain alleviation techniques available to medieval midwives were restricted but not entirely ineffectual. Herbal concoctions such as willow bark, which contains compounds akin to aspirin, and poppy derivatives, which include opiates, could offer some measure of relief. Massage, postural adjustments, and respiratory exercises were also employed to assist women in coping with the discomfort of labor. The spiritual dimensions of medieval childbirth were as pivotal as the physical ones. Midwives often assumed the role of spiritual mentors, leading prayers and invoking divine protection during labor. They might utilize religious artifacts, hallowed water, or blessed objects to impart comfort and safeguard. The conviction in the efficacy of prayer and divine intervention was a fundamental element of the birthing process. The postnatal care administered by medieval midwives extended well beyond the immediate moment of birth. They monitored the mother's convalescence, offered counsel on nursing and infant rearing, and frequently maintained engagement with the family for weeks or months following delivery. This enduring connection was vital for the health and survival of both mother and child. The knowledge repository of medieval midwives encompassed not only childbirth, but also general women's health concerns. They provided guidance on fertility, contraception, and gynecological ailments. This positioned them as significant figures in women's lives throughout their reproductive years, not solely during pregnancy and parturition. The legal obligations incumbent upon medieval midwives were substantial and occasionally perilous. They were frequently required to provide testimony in legal proceedings concerning the legitimacy of births, the paternity of offspring, or the circumstances surrounding maternal or infant demise. This judicial function could place them in the challenging circumstances, particularly when influential families or political interests were involved. The gradual decline of traditional midwifery occurred as male physicians began to exert dominance over childbirth, and as formal medical education became increasingly standardized. Nevertheless, the transition was protracted and irregular, and many of the methodologies and insights developed by medieval midwives continued to influence obstetric care for subsequent centuries. Medieval childbirth constituted a life-or-death wager that women confronted with a blend of anticipation, dread, and resignation. The statistical data was grim. Maternal mortality rates were estimated between 1% and 3% per birth, signifying that a woman bearing multiple children faced a considerable cumulative risk of demise. Infant mortality was even more pronounced, with perhaps 20% to 30% of children perishing before their first birthday. These figures were not mere statistics. They represented the stark reality that shaped every facet of medieval reproductive life. The physical hazards associated with medieval childbirth were manifold and frequently fatal. Prolonged labor could exhaust both mother and infant, leading to death from complications or infection. Presentations of the fetus in a breech or other abnormal position were exceedingly perilous without contemporary surgical interventions. Excessive hemorrhaging during or subsequent to delivery was often beyond control with medieval medical knowledge and instruments. The absence of understanding regarding infection and sterile protocols meant that numerous women who survived the actual birth succumbed to puerperal fever and other infections in the days and weeks following delivery. The environment for childbirth, though meticulously prepared according to medieval conventions, was far from sterile by modern standards. The hands and instruments of attendants, the linens and garments employed, and the general surroundings all presented risks of contagion. The agony of medieval childbirth was managed through a combination of herbal remedies, physical techniques, and spiritual practices. However, effective pain relief was limited. Women were expected to endure labor with fortitude and faith, viewing their suffering as an intrinsic part of the divine plan and a consequence of Eve's transgression. The capacity to bear pain with grace was regarded as a virtue, and excessive complaints could be interpreted as weakness or a deficit in faith. The duration of medieval labor was frequently protracted due to the absence of medical intervention. Without the ability to perform cesarean sections, utilize forceps, or provide other surgical assistance, women might experience labor lasting for days with minimal respite. The exhaustion and dehydration resulting from prolonged labor introduced additional risks for both mother and child. The societal pressures surrounding childbirth were intense and could exacerbate psychological stress in what was already a perilous situation. Women were expected to produce healthy offspring, particularly male heirs, and failure to do so could carry significant repercussions for their marriages and social standing. The fear of disappointing familial and community expectations added another layer of anxiety to an already taxing experience. The seasonal timing of births could profoundly impact outcomes. Infants born during the winter months faced amplified challenges from cold temperatures and restricted food supplies. Summer births could be complicated by heat and an elevated risk of infection. The agricultural calendar also shaped the availability of assistance, as family members might be occupied with essential farm work during specific times of the year. Maternal age was a significant determinant of medieval childbirth outcomes. Very young mothers, who might marry and conceive in their early teens, faced greater dangers due to their physical immaturity. Older mothers, particularly those past 35, also encountered increased hazards. The optimal childbearing age was considered to be the late teens and 20s. Yet, social and economic circumstances frequently prevented women from controlling the timing of their pregnancies. The number of prior births influenced both the risks and the experiences associated with medieval childbirth. First-time mothers encountered the highest risks, as their bodies had not yet adjusted to the birthing process. Nevertheless, women who had numerous children also faced augmented dangers from the cumulative impact of multiple pregnancies and the physical strain of repeated childbearing. The nutritional status of medieval women considerably affected their ability to survive childbirth. Inadequate nutrition during pregnancy could result in complications like anemia, which heightened the likelihood of death from hemorrhage. The limited understanding of prenatal nutrition meant that many women entered labor in a weakened state, diminishing their chances of survival. Emotional and psychological preparation for medieval childbirth often encompassed readiness for death. Women commonly drafted wills, confessed their sins, and reconciled with family members before commencing labor. This preparation served both practical and spiritual purposes, acknowledging the very real possibility of not surviving the ordeal. The support systems available to medieval women during childbirth varied dramatically, depending on social class and family situations. Affluent women might have access to skilled midwives, comfortable birthing chambers, and extensive familial support. Poorer women might only have the assistance of female relatives or neighbors with limited experience and resources. The religious dimensions of medieval childbirth were central to the experience. Women prayed for divine protection, made pledges and offerings, and often had religious relics or blessed objects present during labor. The conviction in divine intervention provided both solace and a means of coping with the absence of effective medical treatments. The aftermath of difficult or unsuccessful births could have lasting repercussions for families and communities. The demise of a mother left children without care and husbands without partners, frequently resulting in economic and social hardship. Infant mortality was common, yet still emotionally devastating, and families had to devise methods for coping with frequent losses while maintaining hope for successful pregnancies. Medieval sexuality was not solely about personal connections and individual desires. It was deeply integrated into economic systems that governed everything from marriage negotiations to inheritance laws. The bedroom, far from being a private domain, detached from commercial considerations, was in fact one of the most economically significant locales in medieval society, where decisions made during intimate moments could impact the financial fortunes of entire families for generations. The dowry system was perhaps the most evident way sexuality and economics intertwined in medieval life. A woman's virginity and reproductive capacity were literally appraised and negotiated as part of marriage contracts. The size of a dowry often reflected not only a family's wealth, but also their assessment of their daughter's marriage ability, which encompassed her beauty, health, fertility, and moral standing. A woman who lost her virginity before marriage might experience a reduction in her dowry or a severe detriment to her marriage prospects. The economic value of children, particularly male heirs, imposed immense pressure on medieval couples to procreate. The ability to bear children was not merely a personal aspiration. It was an economic imperative that influenced property inheritance, familial alliances, and social standing. Women who failed to produce offspring, especially sons, might face divorce, abandonment, or relegation to a subordinate position within their own households. The expense of maintaining medieval sexual relationships was substantial and often underestimated. The attire, cosmetics, and grooming necessary to remain appealing to a spouse represented a considerable ongoing cost. Medical care associated with pregnancy and childbirth could financially ruin families, particularly when complications arose demanding expensive treatments or prolonged care. The regulation of sexuality by medieval authorities was frequently driven by economic rather than moral imperatives. Prostitution was tolerated and regulated in many cities because it generated tax revenue and supported local commerce. Adultery was penalized not solely for being sinful, but because it jeopardized property rights and inheritance laws. Illegitimate offspring presented economic challenges for families and communities, leading to stringent controls on sexual conduct outside marriage. The seasonal patterns of medieval sexuality were closely linked to economic cycles. Marriages were typically scheduled around agricultural schedules, with the majority of weddings occurring after the harvest, when families possessed the means for celebrations and dowries. The timing of conceptions was also influenced by economic factors, as families sought to avoid having infants during the most economically challenging periods of the year. Class distinctions in medieval sexual practices frequently mirrored economic realities rather than moral choices. Wealthy families could afford to uphold strict standards of sexual conduct due to their resources for supervising children and arranging advantageous marriages. Poor families struggling for survival might adopt a more flexible approach to sexual norms if it offered economic benefits or simply facilitated survival. The international trade in sexual services and marriage partners constituted a significant segment of the medieval economy. Affluent men might procure wives from distant regions, expending substantial sums for women exhibiting specific qualities or connections. The trafficking of women for sexual purposes, while morally condemned, was economically lucrative and difficult to eradicate completely. The insurance aspects of medieval sexuality were vital for family financial planning. Having multiple children served partly as an insurance policy against high infant mortality rates. Families required several offspring to ensure that at least some would reach adulthood and be capable of supporting their parents in old age. The economic worth of children as future laborers and caregivers influenced decisions regarding family size and the spacing of pregnancies. The professional dimensions of medieval sexuality gave rise to entire trades and occupations. Matchmakers, marriage brokers, and professional intermediaries earned their livelihoods by facilitating romantic and sexual relationships. Midwives, wet nurses, and child care providers were essential workers whose services were perpetually in demand. Even the production of contraceptives and aphrodisiacs supported specialized artisans and merchants. The legal expenditures related to medieval sexuality could be immense. Disputes concerning dowries, inheritance claims, paternity, and sexual misconduct frequently necessitated costly legal proceedings that could persist for years. The necessity of proving virginity, legitimacy, or sexual fidelity might require witness testimony, physical examinations, and other expensive procedures. The investment aspects of medieval sexuality were intricate and long-term. Families invested heavily in their children's romantic and sexual prospects, funding education, clothing, and social engagements intended to make them desirable marriage partners. These investments might not yield returns for years or decades, but they were crucial for preserving and enhancing familial, social, and economic standing. The risk management dimensions of medieval sexuality demanded careful strategizing and considerable resources. Families had to anticipate the possibility of challenging pregnancies, infant mortality, and maternal death. They needed to establish contingency plans for inheritance and succession, and they were obliged to maintain relationships with multiple potential marriage partners to secure advantageous matches for their offspring. The taxation of medieval sexuality was both direct and indirect. Governments levied taxes on marriage licenses, inheritance transfers, and commercial sexual services. They also profited from the economic activity generated by weddings, celebrations, and the various industries supporting romantic and sexual relationships. The regulation and taxation of sexuality thus represented a significant source of governmental revenue. The insurance and mutual aid components of medieval sexuality were essential for community resilience. Extended families and communities frequently pooled resources to support members through pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing. These informal insurance schemes help distribute the economic risks of reproduction across larger groups, enabling individuals to undertake the necessary risks for family formation and continuity. Medieval lovers did not merely exchange tender affirmations. They articulated carefully coded, socially acceptable sentiments that are often entirely unintelligible to modern ears. The discourse of medieval romance constituted a complex framework of symbols, metaphors, and euphemisms that permitted individuals to convey desire and affection while navigating the stringent social and religious strictures of their era. The lexicon of medieval love was significantly shaped by religious terminology, which introduced certain intriguing complexities. Lovers adopted terminology derived from Christian devotion to articulate their earthly affections, resulting in poetry that could be interpreted as either romantic or spiritual, or occasionally both at once. A knight might refer to his lady as his salvation or his divine illumination. This employed language that was simultaneously charged with romance and religiously appropriate. The tradition of courtly love, popularized by troubadours and poets, established an intricate code for romantic expression, emphasizing suffering, devotion, and unattainable desire. This literary heritage molded how individuals perceived and conveyed their romantic sentiments, though the lived experience often diverged significantly from the idealized verses. The language of courtly love was intentionally artificial and elevated, designed to transmute base physical longing into something noble and spiritual. The utilization of floral symbolism in medieval romantic discourse was both extensive and sophisticated. Different blossoms conveyed specific meanings, enabling lovers to communicate complex messages through seemingly innocuous gifts or illusions. Roses symbolized passion and beauty, with color playing a crucial role. Red roses signified passionate love, white roses denoted pure love, and pink roses indicated gentle affection. Violets represented faithfulness, while forget-me-nots signified true love and remembrance. The allegorical use of animals in medieval love poetry was equally intricate and meaningful. Lovers might liken themselves to various creatures to express different facets of their emotions or predicaments. The hart represented the pursued lover, while the hunter symbolized the pursuer. Birds were frequently employed to symbolize the soul or the beloved, with distinct species carrying varied connotations. The nightingale represented the lover's serenade, while the dove symbolized purity and peace. Seasonal metaphors within medieval romantic language mirrored the agricultural cycles that governed medieval life. Spring signified nascent love and awakening desire, whereas winter symbolized separation or the demise of love. The harvest season could represent the fulfillment of love, while the planting season might symbolize hope and fresh beginnings. These metaphors rendered romantic poetry accessible to audiences whose lives were intimately connected with natural rhythms. Architectural metaphors in medieval love poetry reflected the prominence of castles, churches, and other edifices in medieval society. The beloved could be depicted as a stronghold to be conquered, a sanctuary to be venerated, or a garden to be nurtured. These metaphors afforded poets the means to discuss romantic and sexual relationships using familiar and socially acceptable terms. The musical metaphors in medieval romantic parlance were notably rich and complex. Love was frequently described in terms of harmony, discord, melody, and rhythm. Lovers might be portrayed as instruments playing in perfect concert, or as singers whose voices blended beautifully. The language of music provided a conduit for discussing the emotional and physical dimensions of love in ways that were both attractive and socially sanctioned. The medical and alchemical terminology found in medieval love poetry reflected the era's understanding of the body and emotions. Love was often characterized as an ailment requiring treatment, with symptoms such as fever, insomnia, and loss of appetite. The beloved might be portrayed as the physician capable of curing the lover's affliction, or as the remedy that could restore health and happiness. This medical analogy allowed poets to address the physical ramifications of love in socially appropriate terms. The religious pilgrimage metaphors were particularly favored in medieval love poetry. The lover might cast himself as a pilgrim, journeying to the shrine of his beloved, with the voyage symbolizing the trials and tribulations of courtship. The beloved became a hallowed destination, deserving of devotion and sacrifice. This metaphor enabled poets to elevate romantic love to a spiritual plane while preserving religious respectability. The feudal and chivalric language of medieval love mirrored the social and political structures of the era. Lovers frequently employed the lexicon of feudalism to describe their relationships, with the beloved serving as the lord or lady and the lover as the devoted vassal. This established a framework for discussing power dynamics, loyalty, and service within romantic affiliations, utilizing familiar social concepts. The coded language of medieval love correspondence was necessarily subtle and indirect. Lovers had to convey their feelings while remaining cognizant that their communications might be intercepted and perused by family members, religious authorities, or political adversaries. This gave rise to the development of elaborate systems of cipher, hidden meanings, and symbolic allusions that could transmit intimate messages while maintaining plausible deniability. Regional variations in medieval Romantic language reflected local customs, dialects, and cultural influences. The troubadour tradition originating in southern France developed distinct conventions from the minnesingers of Germany or the courtly poets of England. These regional divergences fostered a rich diversity of Romantic expression, even as common themes and structures persisted across medieval Europe. Class distinctions within medieval Romantic discourse were significant and meticulously maintained. The intricate, educated language of courtly love was primarily the province of the nobility and learned classes. Common people developed their own modes of Romantic expression, which were generally more direct and pragmatic, though frequently influenced by the literary traditions of their social superiors. Gender differences in medieval Romantic language were pronounced and indicative of the era's social expectations. Men were anticipated to be the active pursuers, employing language associated with conquest, service, and adoration. Women were expected to exhibit greater passivity and modesty in their expressions, though they devised their own subtle methods for signaling interest and affection within the confines of social propriety. The evolution of medieval Romantic language over time mirrored shifting social, religious, and cultural circumstances. The early medieval period emphasized duty and practical concerns, whereas the later medieval era witnessed the emergence of more elaborate and emotionally resonant forms of Romantic expression. The influence of classical literature, religious mysticism, and emerging humanistic philosophies all contributed to this progression. The translation and dissemination of medieval Romantic language across linguistic and cultural divides engendered fascinating hybrid forms of Romantic expression. As ideas and literary conventions migrated between different regions and languages, they were adapted and modified to suit local conditions and inclinations. This process of cultural exchange enriched the vocabulary and imagery available to medieval lovers. The performative aspects of medieval Romantic language were vital to its efficacy. Much Romantic poetry was intended for singing, recitation, or performance rather than mere silent reading. The musical and theatrical elements of Romantic expression imparted layers of meaning and emotional resonance that amplified the fundamental linguistic content. The preservation and documentation of medieval Romantic language in manuscripts, letters, and literary works offer contemporary scholars insights into the emotional lives of medieval people. However, the formal and literary character of much of this preserved language means that the everyday expressions of love employed by ordinary individuals are frequently lost to history. Medieval Europe was a society preoccupied with categorizing, regulating, and often condemning various forms of sexual expression. The church, secular authorities, and societal norms established an elaborate framework of sexual taboos, governing everything from acceptable marital positions to severe penalties for behaviors deemed unnatural or sinful. Understanding these proscriptions sheds light on the intricate interplay between desire, morality, and power in medieval society. The dichotomy of natural versus unnatural sexual conduct was central to medieval thought regarding sexuality. The Church maintained that sexual activity served a singular primary purpose: procreation. Consequently, any sexual behavior incapable of resulting in pregnancy was deemed unnatural and sinful. This encompassed not only homosexual conduct, but also certain heterosexual practices, masturbation, and even excessive pleasure within marriage. Punishments for sexual transgressions varied considerably, depending on the specific act, the social standing of the individuals involved, and the jurisdiction in which the offense occurred. Certain sexual crimes carried the death penalty, while others might result in public penance, monetary fines, or temporary banishment. The inconsistency in sentencing often reflected the practical challenges of enforcing sexual morality rather than clear legal principles. The recording of sexual taboos in medieval legal and religious texts provides a captivating window into the actual sexual behaviors of medieval people, despite official disapproval. The very existence of detailed prohibitions and punishments suggests that these behaviors were sufficiently prevalent to necessitate regulation, even if officially condemned. Gender disparities and sexual taboos were pronounced and reflected broader patterns of gender inequality within medieval society. Women faced more severe repercussions for sexual transgressions than men, and their sexual conduct was subjected to closer scrutiny and control. The concept of female honor was intrinsically linked to sexual purity, while male honor was more associated with other forms of behavior and achievement. Class distinctions in the enforcement of sexual taboos were significant and frequently marked by hypocrisy. Affluent and powerful individuals might evade punishment for sexual behaviors that would lead to severe consequences for commoners. The capacity to settle fines, seek refuge, or sway legal outcomes meant sexual restrictions were frequently more rigorously applied to the impoverished and less powerful. Variations in sexual taboos across different regions mirrored local customs, religious persuasions, and political circumstances. While certain areas showed greater tolerance for specific behaviors, others upheld stringent enforcement of sexual regulations. These divergences resulted in a mosaic of sexual norms throughout medieval Europe, which could present challenges and hazards for itinerants and those relocating. The seasonal and temporal dimensions of sexual taboos introduced an additional layer of intricacy to medieval sexual governance. Specific times of the year, days of the week, and religious commemorations came with heightened limitations on sexual conduct. The Church's liturgical calendar established a complex schedule of permissible and forbidden periods for sexual activity, which proved difficult for the common person to adhere to consistently. The comprehension of sexuality during the medieval era, from a medical and scientific standpoint, was rudimentary and often erroneous, yet it still shaped the evolution of sexual prohibitions. Medieval medical practitioners and scholars formulated theories regarding sexual behavior, drawing from classical texts, religious doctrines, and limited empirical observation. These theories frequently reinforced existing taboos, while also establishing new ones based on perceived health risks or moral hazards. The methods of enforcing sexual taboos encompass both formal legal processes and informal societal controls. Ecclesiastical courts, secular tribunals, and community pressure all contributed to the identification and penalization of sexual offenses. The threat of social exclusion, economic boycotts, or physical reprisal could be as potent as official legal sanctions in maintaining sexual standards. The opposition to sexual prohibitions manifested in various ways, ranging from open defiance to subtle circumvention. Certain individuals and communities devised methods to bypass or disregard sexual regulations, while others directly challenged them through their actions or writings. The continued existence of forbidden sexual conduct, despite severe penalties, suggests that human sexuality was not easily constrained by legislative or ecclesiastical authority. The psychological ramifications of sexual taboos for medieval individuals were substantial but challenging to document. The persistent awareness of sexual limitations and the dread of punishment for natural inclinations engendered stress, guilt, and apprehension, impacting numerous facets of life. The assimilation of sexual shame and the suppression of innate impulses had enduring consequences for both individual and collective welfare. The economic dimensions of sexual taboos encompass both the expenses associated with enforcement and the revenue generated from sexual regulation. Courts levied fines on those found guilty of sexual offenses. The Church benefited from penance and offerings from culpable parties. Furthermore, various officials profited from their roles in overseeing sexual conduct. The financial incentives for upholding sexual taboos occasionally clashed with the explicitly stated moral objectives of these restrictions. The international and cross-cultural elements of medieval sexual prohibitions reflected the exchange of concepts and practices among diverse societies. The influence exerted by Islamic, Jewish, and classical sources on Christian sexual ethics resulted in intricate hybrid systems of sexual governance that varied by epoch and locale. Interactions between different cultures through commerce, warfare, and diplomacy also shaped the development and enforcement of sexual taboos. The impact of medieval sexual prohibitions resonated far beyond the medieval period itself. affecting attitudes towards sexuality in subsequent centuries and even into the modern age. Numerous contemporary sexual norms and restrictions can be traced back to medieval origins, albeit with modifications and reinterpretations over time. An understanding of the historical trajectory of sexual taboos offers insights into the ongoing relationship between sexuality, morality, and societal control. In an era where sexual efficacy was linked to everything from marital contentment to political alliances, medieval people developed an extensive and often perilous array of substances believed to augment desire, enhance performance, and boost fertility. The medieval aphrodisiac trade constituted a burgeoning clandestine economy that blended legitimate medical practice with superstition, deception, and, at times, accidental poisoning. The theoretical underpinnings of medieval aphrodisiacs were rooted in the medical theories of the period, particularly the concept of the four humors and the doctrine of signatures. According to these principles, sexual desire and performance were influenced by the bodily equilibrium of qualities such as heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. Substances perceived as hot and moist were thought to incite sexual yearning, whereas cold and dry items were believed to diminish it. The doctrine of signatures posited that the physical appearance of a substance indicated its healing properties. This led to the utilization of various foods and herbs that resembled sexual organs or suggested fertility and virility. Asparagus, carrots, figs, and oysters were all considered aphrodisiacs, partly due to their suggestive shapes or textures, although some of these foods might have offered genuine nutritional advantages supporting sexual health. The exotic character of many medieval aphrodisiacs mirrored the international trade routes that introduced rare and costly substances to European markets. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cardamom were valued not only for their taste but also for their purported aphrodisiac qualities. The high cost of these items rendered them status symbols as well as libido enhancers, fostering a market for both authentic and counterfeit goods. Animal-derived aphrodisiacs employed in medieval times were frequently the most expensive and sought after, though also the most perilous. Rhinoceros horn, tiger penis, and various other exotic animal parts were thought to impart the sexual potency of these creatures to human consumers. The trade in these substances was profitable, yet also contributed to the hunting and endangerment of various species. The preparation and administration of medieval aphrodisiacs were often as critical as the ingredients themselves. Numerous substances required intricate processing, involving specific timings, temperatures, and combinations with other components. The knowledge pertaining to the preparation of these substances was closely guarded by practitioners who could command substantial fees for their expertise. Gender disparities in medieval aphrodisiac consumption reflected broader patterns of sexual expectations and obligations. Men were anticipated to be sexually active and potent, driving a substantial market for male aphrodisiacs. Women were expected to be receptive and fertile, generating demand for substances believed to increase female desire and improve fertility. However, women who exhibited excessive sexual activity might be regarded with suspicion, creating a complex market for female aphrodisiacs. The religious and moral implications of aphrodisiac usage were multifaceted and often contradictory. While the Church generally frowned upon the artificial enhancement of sexual desire, it acknowledged the significance of marital procreation and the perils of sexual insufficiency within marriage. This created an ambiguous area where some aphrodisiac use might be tolerated or even encouraged, while other applications were condemned as sinful or unnatural. The medical profession's relationship with aphrodisiacs was similarly intricate. Licensed physicians might prescribe certain items for sexual dysfunction or infertility, while denouncing the use of others as hazardous or ineffective. The boundary between legitimate medical intervention and charlatanism was frequently indistinct, with numerous practitioners operating in the liminal space between healing and sorcery. The social and economic factors fueling the medieval aphrodisiac trade were considerable and far-reaching. The imperative to produce heirs, sustain sexual relationships, and demonstrate virility established a large and consistent marketplace for these substances. The elevated prices that could be charged for effective or purportedly effective aphrodisiacs made this a lucrative enterprise for those willing to assume the associated risks. The dangers linked to medieval aphrodisiacs were significant and often underestimated by users. Many substances were toxic in substantial quantities or when combined with other components. The absence of standardization and quality control meant users could never be certain of what they were consuming or in what amounts. Fatalities resulting from aphrodisiac poisoning were likely more prevalent than historical records indicate. The psychological aspects of medieval aphrodisiac consumption were as important as the physiological effects. The conviction that a substance would enhance sexual performance could trigger a placebo effect, actually improving function irrespective of the substance's inherent properties. This psychological component made it difficult to ascertain the true efficacy of different aphrodisiacs and contributed to the persistence of ineffectual remedies. The cultural and literary portrayals of aphrodisiacs in medieval literature and art offer perceptions into popular attitudes toward these substances. Love potions and magical elixirs frequently appear in medieval romances and folk tales, suggesting that the use of aphrodisiacs was widely recognized and accepted, even if not always sanctioned by authorities. The international exchange of aphrodisiac knowledge and substances was facilitated by commercial networks, diplomatic connections, and cultural intermingling. Different regions cultivated their own traditions of aphrodisiac use, and these traditions were disseminated and adapted as they spread across Europe and beyond. This exchange contributed to the development of increasingly complex and refined aphrodisiac preparations. The gradual erosion of traditional aphrodisiac use coincided with advancements in medical understanding and a growing awareness of the risks associated with many conventional substances. Nevertheless, this shift was protracted and inconsistent, with numerous traditional aphrodisiacs maintaining their prevalence well into contemporary times. The enduring influence of medieval aphrodisiac practices can still be observed in modern alternative medicine and folk remedies. In medieval Europe, virginity transcended a mere personal condition. It functioned as a political instrument, a form of social capital, and at times, a devastating weapon. The conception of virginity, particularly female virginity, held such paramount importance in medieval societal structures that it permeated every facet of life, from international diplomacy and local gossip to religious dogma and economic exchanges. Grasping the political dynamics of medieval virginity illuminates the intricate interplay of sexuality, power, and social regulation that characterized medieval existence. The economic worth of virginity in medieval society was overtly recognized and meticulously quantified. A bride who was a virgin typically commanded a more substantial dowry and secured superior marriage prospects compared to a non-virgin, thereby establishing a direct financial incentive for families to safeguard their daughter's chastity. The forfeiture of virginity prior to marriage could lead to diminished dowries, broken betrothals, and social opprobrium that extended to entire family lineages. This economic dimension rendered virginity a familial asset, necessitating stringent protection and diligent management. The process of verifying virginity was an intricate and frequently distressing undertaking, involving physical examinations, witness testimonies, and occasionally, legal proceedings. Midwives and other female experts were enlisted to examine brides and furnish attestations regarding their virgin status. These examinations, while invasive, unreliable, and often predicated on flawed medical understanding, carried profound social and legal weight. The religious significance of virginity within medieval Christianity elevated it from a mere social preference to a divine imperative. The Virgin Mary served as the ultimate paragon of feminine purity, and virginity was regarded as a state of spiritual perfection that fostered a closer connection with God. This spiritual dimension imbued virginity with a sacred quality that made its loss not simply a social transgression, but also a spiritual deficiency. The gender-based double standard that surrounded virginity was pronounced and deeply ingrained in medieval culture. While female virginity was held in high esteem and meticulously guarded, male virginity held less significance and was at times even perceived as an indicator of weakness or a lack of virility. This disparity in expectations mirrored broader patterns of gender inequality and the divergent roles assigned to men and women in medieval society. The legal ramifications of virginity were widespread and impacted numerous aspects of medieval jurisprudence. Marriage contracts frequently incorporated specific clauses pertaining to virginity, and the discovery of non-virginity could invalidate marriages or result in legal penalties. Rape statutes were frequently more preoccupied with the loss of virginity than with the inherent violence of the act itself, treating rape primarily as a property offense against the woman's family rather than a personal assault. The social customs woven around the preservation and loss of virginity were elaborate and public. Wedding ceremonies featured various traditions designed to showcase and celebrate the bride's virginity, while the wedding night was often subjected to scrutiny and verification by family members and community representatives. These rituals underscored the societal importance of virginity, while simultaneously imposing additional pressure and anxiety upon young women. The medical comprehension of virginity in medieval times was rudimentary and frequently inaccurate, yet it still shaped social practices and legal procedures. The concept of proof of virginity was not well understood, and numerous other physical indicators were erroneously interpreted as evidence of sexual activity. This medical ignorance resulted in false accusations, unjust punishments, and considerable suffering for women who were wrongly judged to be non-virgins. The class-based distinctions in the treatment of virginity reflected the broader societal inequalities of medieval times. Aristocratic women faced heightened scrutiny and stricter expectations regarding their virginity, but they also possessed greater resources to protect and confirm their status. Common women might encounter less formal oversight, yet they also had fewer safeguards against false accusations or adverse social repercussions. The international and diplomatic dimensions of virginity were significant in medieval politics. Royal marriages were frequently negotiated, in part based on the virginity and fertility of prospective brides, and the verification of a princess's virginity could be a matter of international concern. The loss of virginity by a royal woman could precipitate diplomatic consequences that impacted inter-kingdom relations. Resistance to virginity mandates manifested in diverse ways, ranging from individual acts of defiance to broader social movements that challenge established expectations. Certain women devised methods to conceal the loss of their virginity, while others openly disputed the social import attached to this physical state. These acts of rebellion were often perilous and could incur severe social and legal penalties, yet they also demonstrated the agency and resolve of women who refused to be solely defined by their sexual status. The psychological ramifications of virginity, requirements on medieval women were profound and often detrimental. The constant pressure to maintain and prove their virginity engendered anxiety, fear, and shame that could affect women throughout their lives. The emphasis on virginity as the primary metric of feminine worth made it arduous for women to cultivate alternative sources of self-esteem and identity. The commercial aspects of virginity gave rise to markets for various services and products associated with its preservation and verification. Merchants vended chastity belts, protective amulets, and other items purported to safeguard virginity. Medical practitioners offered examinations and treatments related to virginity, while legal experts specialized in virginity-related disputes and proceedings. The seasonal and temporal dimensions of virginity politics were influenced by religious calendars, agricultural cycles, and social customs. Certain periods of the year were deemed more propitious for marriages and the loss of virginity, while other intervals were associated with heightened vigilance and protection. These temporal patterns created cycles of tension and release surrounding virginity-related concerns. Regional variations in virginity politics reflected local customs, religious influences, and cultural traditions. Some regions adhered to more stringent requirements and elaborate verification procedures, while others adopted a more lenient stance on virginity-related matters. These variations resulted in differing experiences for women depending on their geographical location and the specific traditions of their communities. The technological and medical advancements that influenced virginity politics encompassed improvements in medical knowledge, surgical techniques, and verification methods. As the understanding of female anatomy progressed, certain traditional methods of virginity verification were recognized as unreliable. Although social practices were slow to adapt to new knowledge, literary and artistic depictions of virginity within medieval culture offered insights into prevailing public attitudes and concerns regarding this issue. Narratives of virgin martyrs, stories of lost and reclaimed virginity, and artistic portrayals of pure and impure women alike mirrored and reinforced societal perceptions concerning the significance of female chastity. The gradual decline of extreme virginity politics occurred as evolving social conditions, enhanced medical understanding, and shifting religious perspectives lessened the emphasis on female virginity as the primary measure of worth. However, this transition was protracted and uneven, and numerous elements of virginity politics persisted well into the modern era. While the Church advocated that sexual activity should be exclusively for procreation, the realities of medieval life fostered a robust clandestine market for contraceptive knowledge, devices, and substances. This covert economy operated at the fringes of medieval society, catering to everyone from desperate peasant women to noble ladies requiring spacing of pregnancies for health or political reasons. The realm of medieval contraception was fraught with danger, unreliability, and frequent illegality, yet it was also characterized by innovation, persistence, and a surprisingly widespread presence. The herbal contraceptives employed in medieval times represented centuries of accumulated folk wisdom passed down through networks of women who shared information on reproductive control. Plants such as pennyroyal, tansy, rue, and savin were commonly utilized as abortifacients and contraceptives, frequently prepared as teas, pessaries, or topical applications. While some of these herbs did possess contraceptive properties, they were also highly toxic and could induce severe illness or death if misused. The preparation and distribution of contraceptive herbs were typically managed by older women who had acquired their knowledge through practical experience and apprenticeship. These informal practitioners, sometimes referred to as wise women or cunning women, served as the principal conduits of reproductive health information for their communities. Their knowledge was transmitted orally and varied considerably from region to region, resulting in a diverse array of contraceptive practices across medieval Europe. The barrier methods utilized in medieval contraception were primitive, yet occasionally effective. Pessaries fashioned from various materials, including wool, cotton, and even crocodile dung, were inserted into the vagina to impede conception. Certain women utilized sponges steeped in acidic compounds such as vinegar or lemon juice, which offered rudimentary contraceptive safeguards. These techniques necessitated foresight, meticulous preparation, and frequently resulted in significant discomfort, yet they afforded women a measure of autonomy over their reproductive decisions. The timing methods employed by women in the medieval era were predicated on a limited grasp of the female reproductive cycle, but they exemplified early attempts at natural family planning. Some women endeavored to monitor their menstrual cycles and abstain from sexual intercourse during periods they perceived as fertile. Nevertheless, the absence of precise knowledge regarding ovulation rendered these approaches largely ineffective, although they did underscore women's aspirations to manage their fertility. Male contraceptive strategies, while restricted, were not entirely absent from medieval customs. Coitus interruptus, or withdrawal, was likely the most prevalent male-controlled method, though it demanded considerable self-restraint and mutual agreement. A few men resorted to rudimentary condoms fashioned from animal intestines or bladders, despite their expense, unreliability, and frequent discomfort. The responsibility for contraception typically devolved upon women, who bore the brunt of the consequences should these methods fail. The elements of magic and superstition surrounding medieval contraception were pervasive, reflecting the nascent scientific understanding of reproduction. Charms, amulets, and incantations were frequently employed in conjunction with, or as alternatives to, physical preventative measures. Women might adorn themselves with particular stones or metals, recite specific supplications, or conduct intricate rituals believed to thwart conception. While these practices lacked any genuine contraceptive efficacy, they provided psychological solace and a subjective sense of control over procreation. The informal social networks that facilitated the dissemination of contraceptive knowledge were vital for its transmission. Women exchanged information through familial ties, neighborly relationships, and professional affiliations. Midwives, healers, and other women possessing medical acumen often served as conduits for contraceptive guidance, though they exercised caution in openly sharing such information. Significant and often dire economic pressures underpinned the motivation for contraceptive use. The upkeep of large families proved costly, and during times of scarcity, additional offspring could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The economic imperative to limit family size frequently superseded religious injunctions and societal disapproval, compelling many couples to risk employing hazardous contraceptive tactics. Substantial legal and religious perils were associated with contraceptive use medieval times, fostering an atmosphere of concealment and dread regarding reproductive self-determination. The Church anathematized contraception as sinful and unnatural. Secular authorities, meanwhile, often equated it with homicide or witchcraft, exposing women known to employ contraceptives to accusations of sorcery, moral corruption, or heresy, with potentially fatal repercussions. The international commerce and contraceptive components fostered networks of knowledge and materials that traversed medieval Europe and beyond. Exotic herbs and substances were imported from distant locales, often at considerable expense, based on their purported ability to prevent pregnancy. This trade also facilitated the cross-cultural exchange of contraceptive insights and medical traditions. The efficacy rate of medieval contraceptive methods was notably low, resulting in frequent unintended pregnancies and a subsequent need for alternative resolutions. In instances where contraception proved unsuccessful, women faced arduous decisions regarding whether to continue the pregnancy, seek an abortion, a perilous and frequently illegal undertaking, or arrange swift marriages to legitimize the birth. These failures conversely amplified the demand for contraceptive knowledge and practices. The documentation of medieval contraceptive practices is sparse, largely because these activities were frequently conducted covertly and seldom inscribed in official records. Our understanding primarily derives from medical treatises, ecclesiastical condemnations, legal transcripts of prosecutions, and sporadic allusions in literature and personal correspondence. This limited documentation may not accurately represent the full spectrum of practices adopted by the general populace. The psychological ramifications of contraceptive use in the medieval period were intricate and often paradoxical. Women were cognizant of the inherent risks and official disapproval associated with their contraceptive endeavors, yet they also perceived them as essential for their survival and family well-being. This engendered a cognitive dissonance, which they resolved by emphasizing the tangible advantages while downplaying the moral and physical hazards. The technological constraints in the production of medieval contraceptives meant that even conscientious practitioners could not consistently manufacture safe or effective products. The absence of comprehension regarding reproductive biology, chemical interactions, and dose-response relationships precluded the creation of reliable contraceptive preparations, even when potentially effective ingredients were employed. The gradual obsolescence of traditional medieval contraceptive customs occurred as medical understanding advanced and safer. More effective methods became accessible. Nevertheless, this transition was protracted and uneven, with many traditional practices persisting well into the modern era. The enduring influence of medieval contraceptive knowledge can still be observed in various folk remedies and alternative medical practices presently utilized in certain regions globally. The wedding night in medieval Europe bore little resemblance to the intimate, romantic occasion modern couples might anticipate. Instead, it was a highly formalized, frequently public event serving legal, social, and religious objectives that extended far beyond the personal desires of the bride and groom. The consummation of marriage was deemed so paramount that it was often observed, validated, and recorded in manners that would appear intrusive and peculiar to contemporary sensibilities. The legal significance of consummation within medieval marriage law cannot be overstated. A marriage was not officially deemed valid until it had been consummated, and failure to do so could serve as grounds for annulment. This legal stipulation transmuted the wedding night from a mere personal milestone into a critical legal proceeding with implications for inheritance rights, political pacts, and family honor. The pressure to achieve marital consummation induced anxiety and performance expectations that could be profoundly overwhelming for young couples. Preparations for the wedding night commenced well in advance of the actual ceremony, encompassing both practical and ritualistic components. The bride and groom might receive guidance from family members, clergy, or seasoned married couples regarding anticipated experiences and appropriate conduct. Special foodstuffs, beverages, and herbal concoctions were frequently provided to augment fertility, alleviate apprehension, or enhance performance. The bridal chamber was meticulously prepared with consecrated linens, religious artifacts, and, on occasion, aphrodisiac substances. The blessing of the marriage bed was a common ritual, involving clergy or senior family members sanctifying the space designated for consummation. This benediction aimed to invoke divine protection and favor upon the couple's intimate union and future progeny. The bed might be sprinkled with holy water, adorned with religious iconography, or blessed through specific prayers intended to foster marital harmony and successful procreation. The witnessing of consummation, a practice that varied by locale and social stratum, was surprisingly widespread across medieval Europe. In certain instances, familial members or designated witnesses would remain present in the chamber during the act of consummation, while in others they might wait outside, entering subsequently to confirm that the union had occurred. The objective of this witnessing was to furnish legal affirmation that the marriage had been duly consummated and to preempt subsequent disputes concerning the validity of the union. Physical evidence of consummation was often mandated and meticulously preserved as legal documentation. The blood-stained linens from the wedding night were commonly exhibited or retained as proof of the bride's virginity and the successful consummation of the marriage. This practice was particularly salient for noble lineages, where the legitimacy of subsequent heirs could hinge upon demonstrating the proper consummation of the marriage. The timing of consummation was frequently carefully determined based on ecclesiastical calendars, astrological considerations, and practical imperatives. Some couples were advised to await propitious dates or times, while others were encouraged to consummate immediately to secure the legal efficacy of their union. The Church's strictures on sexual activity during specific periods could complicate the timing of consummation and impose additional stress on newlyweds. The role of alcohol and other substances in wedding night rituals was significant and often problematic. Wine, ale, and other spirits were commonly offered to reduce inhibitions and alleviate nervousness, but excessive imbibing could impede successful consummation. Herbal remedies and purported aphrodisiacs were also employed, though their efficacy was dubious and their safety often questionable. The gendered expectations surrounding consummation were heavily influenced by prevailing medieval conceptions of male and female sexuality. Men were anticipated to exhibit knowledge, assertiveness, and proficiency in their sexual performance, whereas women were expected to be passive, demure, and receptive. These expectations imposed distinct forms of pressure on both brides and grooms and could precipitate performance anxiety, disappointment, and relational discord. The age factors involved in medieval marriage consummation frequently presented challenges by contemporary standards. Many unions featured exceedingly young participants, at times children unprepared physically or emotionally for carnal relations. The legal and societal imperatives to consummate these marriages could inflict trauma, injury, and lasting psychological harm on young brides and grooms. Medical knowledge regarding consummation in medieval eras was scant and frequently flawed. However, it still shaped practices and expectations. Medieval medical practitioners and academics developed theories concerning sexual anatomy, fertility, and the mechanics of intercourse, often based on insufficient or erroneous data. These hypotheses influenced counsel offered to newlyweds and could foster unrealistic hopes or hazardous customs. The societal repercussions of unconsummated marriages were dire and could impact entire families and collectives. A marriage unable to be consummated might be annulled, precipitating scandal and potentially disrupting political pacts or economic arrangements. The disgrace linked to sexual failure could shadow individuals throughout their lives and impede their capacity to establish future connections. Regional and cultural variances in consummation ceremonies mirrored local traditions, religious influences, and social hierarchies. Certain locales possessed elaborate rites and extensive witnessing mandates, while others adhered to more private and understated practices. These divergences resulted in distinct experiences for couples contingent on their residence and their community's specific customs. The documentation of consummation rituals in medieval chronicles offers insight into the societal significance of these customs, while also exposing the intrusive and often distressing character of medieval marital practices. Legal documents, ecclesiastical records, and personal narratives delineate various facets of consummation ceremonies. Nevertheless, The private and delicate nature of these occurrences means that a considerable amount of information has been lost or deliberately obscured. The psychological toll of public consummation rites on medieval couples was considerable, but seldom acknowledged at the time. The pressure to perform sexually before observers or under scrutiny could generate enduring trauma and interpersonal difficulties. The emphasis placed on physical validation of consummation could relegate the wedding night from an intimate expression of affection to a mechanistic legal prerequisite. The gradual erosion of elaborate consummation rituals occurred as shifting societal perspectives, enhanced comprehension of sexuality, and evolving legal mandates diminished the focus on public verification of marital consummation. However, this transition was protracted and inconsistent, with certain elements of these rituals persisting well into the early modern era in specific locales and social strata. As we conclude our exploration of the intimate, intricate, and frequently bewildering realm of medieval sexuality, it is valuable to consider how these ancient customs, beliefs, and attitudes continue to shape our contemporary understanding of love, relationships, and human sexuality. The medieval period, far from being an era of simple repression or ignorance, was in fact a time of remarkable complexity, contradiction, and innovation in sexual matters that laid the groundwork for many prevailing attitudes and practices. The Church's sway over medieval sexuality engendered patterns of guilt, shame, and regulation that endured long after the medieval period concluded. The association of sexuality with sin, the prioritization of procreation over pleasure, and the meticulous regulation of intimate conduct established precedents that influenced Western perspectives on sexuality for centuries. Even today, many contemporary debates concerning sexual morality, reproductive rights, and religion's part in personal relationships can be traced back to medieval origins. The economic aspects of medieval sexuality, including the dowry system, the commodification of virginity, and the regulation of prostitution, established patterns of sexual commerce that continue to impact modern relationships. The notion that sexuality possesses economic worth, that reproductive capacity influences social standing, and that intimate connections are subject to market forces all have medieval precedents that persist in various guises today. The gender inequities that characterized medieval sexuality fostered lasting patterns of discrimination and double standards that continue to affect contemporary relationships. The divergent expectations for male and female sexual conduct, the emphasis on female purity and male prowess, and the unequal ramifications of sexual transgression all established precedents that influence modern gender relations, notwithstanding their subsequent challenge and modification. The medical and scientific insights into sexuality that emerged during the medieval period, though often inaccurate by contemporary standards, represented significant early endeavors to comprehend human reproductive biology and sexual behavior. The medieval emphasis on the link between physical health and sexual function, the recognition of sexuality as a legitimate medical concern, and the development of treatments for sexual dysfunction all contributed to the foundation of modern sexual medicine. The literary and artistic traditions that sprang from medieval sexuality, such as courtly love poetry, romantic literature, and artistic representations of love and desire, established cultural paradigms that continued to influence contemporary expressions of romance and sexuality. The idealization of romantic love, the focus on emotional connection in sexual relationships, and the use of symbolic language to convey intimate sentiments all have medieval origins that persist in modern culture. The legal frameworks that governed medieval sexuality established precedents for the regulation of intimate relationships that continue to inform contemporary law. Marriage law, inheritance rights, reproductive regulations, and the legal treatment of sexual offenses all have medieval origins that have been adapted and updated, but not entirely discarded in modern legal systems. The social rituals and customs surrounding medieval sexuality, including courtship practices, wedding ceremonies, and relationship milestones, establish patterns that continue to influence contemporary social behavior. Many modern wedding traditions, courtship customs, and relationship expectations can be traced back to medieval roots, though they have been adapted to current circumstances and values. The international and cross-cultural exchanges that defined medieval sexuality created patterns of cultural diffusion and adaptation that continue to shape contemporary global sexual culture. The movement of ideas, practices, and attitudes across cultural boundaries during the medieval period set precedents for the globalization of sexual culture that continues today. The resistance and adaptation that characterized medieval responses to sexual regulation demonstrated human creativity and resilience in the face of restrictive social conditions. The ways in which medieval individuals found to express their sexuality despite official disapproval, to maintain intimate relationships under challenging circumstances, and to adjust to evolving social conditions, offer models for contemporary efforts to navigate complex sexual and social environments. The technological and medical innovations that arose from medieval sexuality, such as contraceptive methods, fertility treatments, and sexual health practices, established foundations for modern reproductive medicine and sexual health care. While medieval techniques were often perilous and ineffectual, they represented important early attempts to control reproduction and address sexual dysfunction that contributed to the evolution of modern medical practice. The psychological insights that emerged from medieval sexuality, including the recognition of the connection between emotional and physical intimacy, the understanding of sexuality as a fundamental human drive, and the awareness of the psychological impact of sexual regulation, contributed to the foundation of modern psychological comprehension of human sexuality. The medieval acknowledgement that sexual fulfillment was crucial for mental and physical well-being, despite official disapproval, anticipated many modern insights regarding sexuality's role in human flourishing. The educational aspects of medieval sexuality, such as the transmission of sexual knowledge through informal networks, the role of experienced practitioners in guiding younger individuals, and the development of specialized expertise in sexual matters, established patterns of sexual education that continue to influence how people learn about sexuality today. The medieval emphasis on practical knowledge and experiential learning provided models for contemporary approaches to sexual education and counseling. The spiritual and philosophical dimensions of medieval sexuality, including the integration of physical and spiritual love, the pursuit of transcendence through intimate unions, and the exploration of the connection between earthly and divine love, contributed to ongoing discussions about the meaning and purpose of human sexuality. The medieval attempt to reconcile physical desire with spiritual aspiration continues to influence contemporary debates on sexuality's role in human existence. The community and social aspects of medieval sexuality, such as the involvement of extended families and communities in intimate relationships, the collective responsibility for sexual regulation, and the social support for reproductive health, provided models for community engagement in sexual matters that continue to influence contemporary approaches to sexual health and relationship support. The seasonal and cyclical dimensions of medieval sexuality, its connection to natural rhythms, its integration within agricultural and religious calendars, and its positioning as part of broader natural and social cycles, presented understandings of sexuality that have largely diminished in modern industrial societies, but are currently being re-examined in contemporary discourse on natural family planning and comprehensive sexual health strategies. Medieval artistic and creative expressions of sexuality, the utilization of symbolism and metaphor for conveying intimate sentiments, the emergence of romantic literature and poetry, and the creation of visual art that lauded human affection and longing, established traditions of sexual expression that continue to shape contemporary art, literature, and popular culture. The political facets of medieval sexuality, the employment of sexual regulation as a means of social control, the link between sexual conduct and political authority, and the part sexuality played in diplomatic and international affairs, offered insights into the relationship between sexuality and power that remain pertinent to current political and social analysis. Environmental and ecological considerations within medieval sexuality, the relationship between human reproduction and environmental conditions, the influence of climate and seasons on sexual behavior, and its incorporation into wider ecological systems, provided perspectives on sexuality that are being revitalized in current discussions on environmental well-being and sustainable population management. Technological advancements stemming from medieval sexuality, such as improvements in contraceptive techniques, developments in fertility interventions, and progress in sexual health care, laid the groundwork for modern reproductive technologies that continue to develop and advance. The medieval inclination towards experimenting with novel methods and technologies, notwithstanding associated risks and societal disapprobation, provided models for contemporary innovation in sexual and reproductive health. Global and cross-cultural viewpoints arising from medieval sexuality, encompassing the exchange of sexual knowledge and practices across diverse cultures, the adaptation of sexual customs to local contexts, and the evolution of hybridized sexual traditions, established frameworks for cultural exchange that persist in influencing contemporary global sexual culture and the ongoing transformation of sexual norms and practices. As we conclude this examination of medieval sexuality, it becomes evident that this era was not characterized by mere repression or ignorance, but rather represented a complex period of invention, assimilation, and human ingenuity amidst challenging circumstances. The inhabitants of medieval Europe, despite the constraints of their era, discovered avenues for expressing their sexuality, sustaining intimate connections, and cultivating meaning and aesthetic value in their personal lives. The legacy of medieval sexuality extends beyond simple historical curiosity. It functions as a living influence that continues to mold present-day attitudes, customs, and dialogues surrounding human sexuality. Comprehending this legacy aids in appreciating both the progress made in sexual freedom and knowledge, and the extent to which our contemporary sexual culture is rooted in medieval foundations. The medieval experience also serves as a reminder that sexuality is invariably situated within broader social, economic, political, and cultural frameworks that shape how individuals perceive and articulate their intimate desires. The predicaments faced by medieval individuals in navigating these contexts, reconciling personal aspirations with societal expectations, managing the risks and rewards of sexual behavior, and finding significance and connection in intimate relationships are challenges that individuals still confront today, albeit in altered forms and circumstances. Perhaps most crucially, the medieval experience illustrates the fortitude and inventiveness of human sexuality when confronted with regulation, limitation, and social oversight. Despite the numerous obstacles they encountered, medieval people found ways to love, connect, and express their sexuality that were meaningful and fulfilling within the confines of their time. This resilience and creativity continue to inspire and inform contemporary endeavors to foster more open, healthy, and satisfying approaches to human sexuality. The fire crackles softly as our journey through medieval sexuality reaches its end. The shadows of those long-ago lovers navigating church restrictions, family expectations, and social taboos recede back into history. Yet, their legacy endures in every relationship we form, every intimate moment we share, and every struggle we face in balancing desire with societal expectations. They remind us that sexuality is both profoundly personal and intrinsically social, both timeless and historically specific, serving as a source of both joy and contention. In their courage to love despite prohibitions, to seek pleasure despite societal disapproval, and to forge intimacy despite scrutiny, they demonstrated that human sexuality cannot be completely controlled or suppressed. It invariably finds a way to manifest, to establish connection, and to imbue human life with meaning. And in this persistence, this creativity, this fundamental human impulse to connect with others in the most intimate ways possible, we perhaps discover the most beautiful and enduring lesson of medieval sexuality, that love, in all its configurations, will always find a way. Thank you for accompanying me on this exploration of the intimate landscape of medieval sexuality. If you found this journey into history's most private moments enlightening, please share in the comments what other historical subjects you would like me to investigate. Until our next encounter, may you rest well and appreciate the privacy afforded by modern times.